people and the future descendants of the Lenni Lenape people. Wanted to also welcome all of the people in the room, in particular, those of you who hold titles, those of you who may be leaders in your communities, in your societies, in your clans. I come from the Bear Clan of the Tuscarora Nation. I also work as Assistant Director of the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment at State University of New York up in Syracuse, in Onondaga territory, Unyat-Takahaga, which is the people of the hills, the capital of our confederacy. I'd like to welcome everyone to this unique and rare opportunity to hear from Indigenous leaders, and probably the first panel I've been on where it's really great to have all Indigenous women comprising the panel, which is more than appropriate today. And we hope that their words here will carry you forward into addressing the changes that we are facing both in Indigenous communities and in non-Indigenous places around the world. First, I'd like to begin by inviting Takaya Blaney up to share in song and to start us off in a good way. Takaya.
Hello, my name is Takaya Blaney. My ancestral name is Jojo Jammu. I am from the Tla'amin Nation, a Coast Salish nation located 100 miles north of Vancouver, BC. As an Indigenous youth, I'm involved in protecting climate, protecting lands, protecting waters, because I recognize that the impacts of climate change will be felt not only within my generation, but first and foremost on my lands. When we talk about a climate apocalypse, it's also important to recognize that we as Indigenous people have been surviving an apocalypse since first contact, a complete destruction of our environments and disconnection between us and our right to subsist off of our territories. For Indigenous communities and Indigenous young people who are on the front lines of climate change, who exist on ground zero for extractive industry and for climate impact, it is important to center these voices, and not just center these voices, but be critical about how we center these voices. Because I see in these spaces, coming from frontline efforts, people on the ground don't know what's happening here. People on the ground aren't aware of the resources that people in this room are connected to. I traveled here with youth from the Unistoten camp. Unistoten earlier this year was raided by militarized police. Unarmed Indigenous water protectors were brutalized. And the youth there who are maintaining those front lines, they need to be in these rooms, and they need to their voices to be uplifted. They need to not just be invited here to sing or engage in a tokenistic way, but we need front lines, and we need higher levels of change. We need them to intersect, because I don't really see them meaningfully intersect at this point. And I'd also like to recognize that this panel is all Indigenous women, and that's also a very powerful thing. We need Indigenous women voices here. So I'm going to share the Woman's Warrior Song. And this is a song to honor missing and murdered Indigenous women, because that is also a casualty of climate change. When you have settler men coming into our territory and our women go missing as a result of construction, as a result of desecration against our earth. Yahio, 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 Yahio. Yahio, hey, Yahio, Yahio, hey, Yahio, Yahio, hey, Yahio, hey, Yahio, Yahio, hey, Yahio, Yahio, hey, Yahio. Fetch. Thank you.
Nyawahat, Takaya. What we're going to try to do today is we're going to introduce each panelist individually, and they're going to talk a little bit about their work regarding climate change in their own home communities. And then we're going to have a few questions and open it up for the audience. So I'd like first to introduce Mandy Gull. Mandy is the Deputy Grand Chief of the Cree Nation Government. First elected to public office in 2014, she served as Deputy Chief of her home community, the Cree First Nation of Waswanipi. As Deputy Chief, Mandy represented her home community in its efforts to protect in its last interest intact forests, including the Broadback River Valley. As Deputy Grand Chief, Mandy serves as the Chairman of the EU Land Use Planning Commission, Justice Committee member, and leads the Cree Quebec Table on Environment and Protected Areas. She has been a tireless voice for protecting the Cree territory from industrial development and has been working across Cree communities using groundbreaking mapping systems to establish protected areas that safeguard the territory's wildlife and secure the Cree's way of life. Welcome, Mandy. Mandy, would you give us a few words about your work today?
Listam ga Jojo Jammu and Skumnom Shagaduxniak, meeting get near Jewish Hamgatotenhau, or the Lapnina Hai Decho, or the Sima, the Skywin Skumgo, Jesus Coach Gaduxno, and how, Habits Nuktado, Yoga, Mastado, a bit Nambuitisti, Niwajamad Gam Shandinim, the Betin Takonjis. Welcome, good morning. My name is Mandy Gull. I'm the Deputy Grand Chief of the Cree Nation of Iwischi. I shared my words in Cree. I'm very thankful that we are speakers of our Cree language, so it is with pride to speak these words in Cree first. I also acknowledge the territory of the Lapnai Nation whom we're visiting and thanking them for bringing us blessings. I'd also like to thank our singer for singing about true words that we feel in Canada also. And lastly, welcoming and thanking these women to be sitting on the panel with us today, all working towards the same initiative, climate change, and preventing destruction of our territories. Good morning, everybody.
Nyawa, Mandy. Next, we have Bernadette DeMint. Bernadette is the Executive Director of the Gwich'in Steering Committee, and she is Gwich'in Z Gwich'in. She was raised in Fort Yukon and spent her summers in Benicia. Bernadette's great-grandmother was Oris Moses from Old Crow in the Canadian territory of the Yukon, and her grandfather, Daniel Oris, is from Fort Yukon, Alaska. Bernadette is the mother of 5 children and the grandmother of 5 beautiful grandchildren. She takes this position very serious, and it has transformed her life to better serve her people. Bernadette stands strong to protect the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge coastal plain, the porcupine caribou herd, and the Gwich'in way of life. Bernadette is a council member for the Arctic Refuge Defense Council, and she also serves as an advisory board member for Indian Collective, that's NDN, the Care of Creations Task Force, Native Movement Alaska, and Defend the Sacred Alaska. She is a tribal member of the Gwich'in Z Gwich'in tribal government. Welcome, Bernadette.
Bernadette DeMint. My name is Bernadette DeMint, Executive Director of the Gwich'in Steering Committee. I am from Fort Yukon, Alaska, which is 8 miles above the Arctic Circle. I want to thank everybody for coming. I'm thankful for my Indigenous sisters that are up here. It's not always easy doing this work. I also want to recognize Takia and Lexine, two young youth that are taking the time. They could be doing anything else but their hair. So thank you both also. The first Gwich'in gathering that was held in over 150 years was in 1988 when the Gwich'in elders of Alaska and Canada came together. And they came together because people were coming into our homelands promising us jobs and money and a good life. And two elders from the community of Old Crow were very concerned. They didn't see this, as a good thing. Our resources are on the land. It's the water. It's the animals. Those are our resources that sustained us for thousands of years. So they formed the Gwich'in Steering Committee, where I work. And our purpose is, our mandate is to protect our sacred land, which is known to everybody else as the Arctic Refuge. To us, it's Ejikwats'an Gondai Gotlet, the sacred place where life begins. We don't step foot there. It is so sacred to us that we don't go there. And in 2017, Trump's administration opened it up to oil and gas development. It's hard doing this work when we're up against so much dishonesty and misleading statements. But we continue to do this work because in 1988, our elders told us to go out and tell the world that we are here, to do it in a good way and not to compromise our position. It's 2019 and we're fighting for our way of life, for our human rights. And we're not asking for anything but to coexist in a so ever-changing world. But we have every right to be here. We have every right to live as we've always have. And that was with the porcupine caribou herd. I'm a caribou person. I am a caribou people. My people are caribou people. All our songs, stories, and dances are directed to the caribou. We don't worship them, but we hold them to such high standards. Our creation story tells us that a piece of the caribou heart lies within mine, and a piece of my heart lies within the caribou. And that we have always took care of each other. They've taken care of my people for thousands of years. We migrated alongside them for over 40,000 years, and now it's our turn to take care of them. If you look at, there's maps here. If you look at the map, if you look at the communities, the Gwich'in communities, and the migratory route of the porcupine caribou herd, they're identical. My ancestors settled us on the migratory route so that we could continue to live and thrive off of them. But because Alaska, we are dealing with such crazy climate change, we're dying almost 2 to 3 times faster than the rest of the world. So many of our communities no longer get the caribou. For instance, where I'm from, they have to go all the way to the border, and that's dangerous. We have 33 coastal communities that are literally falling into the ocean. We have rivers and lakes full of dead fish. Our birds are falling out of the sky, and we don't know what to do. We have to slow down the process of oil and gas development. So I'm here to represent my people, not just the Gwich'in people, but I'm here using my voice for our animals. Birds from 6 different continents and from all the states migrate to the Arctic Refuge. The porcupine caribou herd, they are the last land mammals on the planet that travel that distance. They go up there every year, where they have up to 40,000 calves in a 2-week period. And mosquitoes can kill a newborn calf. So the wind from the ocean, it helps. The birds that migrate there, their droppings help the food grow. So we are interconnected Our survival is interconnected to our land, to our water, and to our animals. The air we breathe, we need a healthy ecosystem. This is one of the last untouched ecosystems on the planet, and we need to protect it. I just want to say thank you guys for coming. Thank you for listening. Masicho.
Yawa Bernadette. Next we have Patty Ferguson Boney. Patty is a member of the Poinasheen Indian tribe in Louisiana and the director of the Indian Legal Clinic at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law, Arizona State University. Patty is an expert on Indian law, election law, voting rights, and status clarification of tribes. She has advanced the causes of tribal recognition and voting rights through litigation and expert testimonies to federal and state legislatures. Her tribe, the Poinasheen of Louisiana, has been struggling for cultural survival after decades of dramatic land losses caused by the massive interventions of oil companies in their wetlands, interventions that have made them more vulnerable to the impacts of the climate crisis. Patty has been fighting for the federal recognition of the Poinasheen tribe and recognition of the tribe's Aboriginal territory, as well as sacred sites and mechanisms to protect their land and cultural rights in the face of an imminent climate-forced displacement. Welcome, Patty.
Thank you. I feel so honored to be here to speak to y'all about my people, the Poinasheen. Many people don't know who we are because we're a small community located about an hour and a half southwest of New Orleans. For those of you who don't know, 90% of the coastal land loss in the United States is in Louisiana, and we occupy the fastest eroding basin in the world. And as a result, we have already had to relocate to our current location because of land loss, primarily caused by extractive industries that have cut up our lands and the rerouting of the Mississippi River, which has levied the natural flow of the Mississippi River, which created topsoil redevelopment. And actually, it was a very fertile area. We had agriculture, fishing, hunting, and we're still subsistence fishermen. We still hunt, but it's become more challenging. And one of the things that impacts us is that we're not federally recognized, which means we're not on a list created by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which says you have rights and can consult directly with the federal government. In our community, because we weren't federally recognized, the state did not want to provide education to our people, so many people from our community didn't go to high school until the late 1960s, which of course then impacts our rights because people couldn't speak English, and a lot of oil and gas, which the boom started in the 30s, tried to take advantage of this situation by exploiting our land and our resources. As a result, in the 1990s, they were trying to carve through one of our burial mounds, and so our people went out with guns, and we're very upset with this, obviously, and so we've had an Aboriginal land title claim against this oil company since the 1990s, and the federal government has decided, or the courts decided, that they can't decide this land claim until the federal government decides to recognize us. So we have a lot of challenges because of our small nature, but also because of our legal status, which impacts a lot of our other rights. And we're very dedicated to maintaining our lifeways, our cultural heritage, and so I work with my community on responses to environmental issues, also on federal recognition, and trying to create frameworks to protect our people for the long term. I'd like to say that I'm honored to be here with my Indigenous sisters who all have important messages, but also I'm very honored to have heard the song that the youth shared with us. And I agree with her that the youth need to really have a voice in this, and we see youth who are impacted by this, and they want to have a voice. And so whatever we can do to encourage that, I think is very important.
Betty. Next we have Chloe Dragon Smith. Chloe Dragon Smith is Dene Solin Métis from Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories, where she grew up close to her Indigenous cultural values and learned traditional skills for living on the land. And I know she's currently tanning a moose hide, so she's got to get back to that. Chloe holds a degree in earth science from the University of Victoria, and through her work has sought to bring people closer to the natural world. With the Canadian Parks Council, Chloe co-chaired an intergenerational citizen working group called Connecting a New Generation with Nature. This work published the Nature Playbook, which is an inspiring guide on how everyone can work to connect young people with nature in Canada. She was on the National Advisory Panel for the Pathway to Canada Target 1, which was a panel advising the Canadian Minister of Environment and Climate Change on reaching a biodiversity target. 17% of all land in Canada protected by 2020. She continues to do this work through an organization called the Indigenous Leadership Initiative. Currently, Chloe works for herself as a land relationships consultant and works on all kinds of projects around people's relationship with land. She co-founded a business called Bush Kids in the Northwest Territories. This learning program draws on the traditions of land-based learning and works with kids in a place-based setting to help foster a relationship with the land. Bush Kids is working towards institutional change in the public school system. Welcome, Chloe.
Atlanite, the Sezi Chloe Dragonsmith, Soulier, Denende Stiasti. Sets E Ama Brenda Dragon Hulier, Sets E Abba Leonard Smith Hulier. My name is Chloe Dragonsmith. I come from the Northwest Territories in Canada, or as we say, Denende. So I'm Dene Saint-Liné, very close, and French on my mom's side and German on my dad's side. I grew up on the land, learning my Indigenous learning principles, and that's where this all started for me. As a mixed blood person, I have a really deep intrinsic understanding of Indigenous worldviews and also Western worldviews. So I'm always thinking about that in the work that I do. And as Neil was saying, I do all kinds of work around humans' relationship with land. And that is my climate leadership. It's connecting people to the land to build relationships with both land and community, to remind us that we're part of land, we're part of these earth systems, and we're reliant on them for everything. Climate change, to me, it's not a fight against any part of Earth's system or against humanity, but rather we need to relearn how to understand and to love our home. And to me, this is a deeply Indigenous solution because, again, it is coming from a place of us being part of these systems, part of nature. And I think, as in terms of a long-term solution to how we're going to exist on this planet, it's a part that we can't forget about. In Den and Day in the Northwest Territories, I think that land relationships are something that we do really well. And I'm looking forward to chatting a little more about it. And you'll have to excuse me, I have a pretty bad cold right now, but I'm feeling also very uplifted to be up here with my Indigenous sisters and on this panel. So really happy to be here. Thahuna, everybody, for coming.
Nyawa, Chloe. So I feel like I should move up front to the stage instead of standing behind the mic here, but I know it's a mic'd event, so thank you, ladies. Thank you for sharing a little bit about your perspectives on climate change in your home communities. I know lots of us in the audience and in academies and institutions are very interested in the role of traditional knowledge and the role of what is called traditional ecological knowledge and its relationship to scientific ecological knowledge. It's sort of TEK meets SEK in a lot of these situations. I wonder if any of you would be willing to share a little bit about how you're working within traditional knowledge systems, indigenous knowledge, in combating climate change. Anybody? Sure.
I could, yeah. So our community has been working with Louisiana Sea Grant on trying to blend contemporary knowledge with traditional ecological knowledge to work on resiliency and also identifying vulnerability. And this process has been ongoing for a number of years. First, obviously, building trust, but then using our knowledge holders, which are our people, mainly our fishermen, to identify places and changes in the land. And this is important because when we've asked for restoration projects in the past, the government or scientists have said the science doesn't support it. But the inputs of what's going into that science often have different values than what our values are. So we're working with Sea Grant to basically use our TEK to identify places that are sustainable so that we can recommend projects for restoration in our area. I told y'all that it's like the fastest eroding basin in the United States, but it was once very fertile, and there could be projects that could be done to help make us more resilient, because that's the ultimate goal. And I'll just give you an example. So this year we worked with some of our partners to protect one of our mound areas that was cut through by an extractive industry. They created a canal that widened. It was a small canal, maybe this big, but it's widened to maybe, larger, two boats could pass through at the same time. And so as a result of that, part of the mound has started to break off because the channel is so deep now, the water comes in faster. And so we worked with our partners to create a project to use recycled oyster shells, because oysters, whenever a certain time of the year, they spat, and so then it hardens and it can create a stronger barrier, which is natural to our area. And so we use the knowledge from that TEK also to show why this place is important and why it's worth protecting. And I think it's important to think about what those other inputs are using that traditional knowledge. And so it's very important to blend that, because then you can find projects that may be more appropriate for your area, and also to advocate for that restoration or for protection.
Thank you, Patty. Mandy, how about Cree territory?
Sure. I love this question because I really think it gives us the opportunity to highlight the work that we've been doing. So for me to respond, I would first like to frame the Cree Nation. We are a northern Quebec community of 10 nations. Our territory, it represents roughly 1/3 of Quebec, 350,000 square kilometers. And a little over 40 years ago, we signed a treaty with the government of Quebec when the project of the century was announced, when they were building hydroelectric development in the north. And through this treaty process, we've been allocated duties and obligations to carry out certain activities. So we govern ourselves through the Cree Nation government. We also operate our own school board in all of the communities. We operate all of the schools. We have freedom of curriculum. We teach health care. We operate our own healthcare, we offer clinical services in each of the communities. We have Cree culture. We have institutes and associations that focus on teaching Cree culture and carrying out Cree culture. Our territory is organized by trap lines. So one trap line is allocated to a family where people still to this day hunt, fish, and trap. I'm proud to brag that this morning my husband killed a moose. So I'm very pleased to go home and have good food. But the reason why I think this question is so important for the Cree is we're kind of here sharing a story of what it means to be a success in collaborating with your government. For the past 10 years, we've been creating a protected areas network. I'm very pleased that my protected areas coordinator is here with me. What we've been doing is taking Cree traditional knowledge, interviewing Taliban, asking them where their cultural heritage sites are, where they've been hunting, where their moose yards are, where their fish fawning habitats are, where they have traditional sites of heritage, things related to Adyukan, places associated with legends, areas associated with vegetation, with wildlife, with different types of things like medicines that are gathered by the Crees. So taking this information and creating a protected areas network in the Cree territory is based on input from the front lines, from the Taliban who's there actively hunting, trapping, managing his territory. And the unique part of the Cree is sitting at the Cree-Quebec table on environment and protected areas. We have the opportunity to work with the Ministry of Environment and the fight against climate change, where they have undertaken an initiative to really focus on biodiversity in Quebec. So marrying these two sets of criteria, traditional and scientific, have developed a really unique network based on the needs of the Cree First Nation of USG, but also capturing things of importance to Quebec. And you know, I'm very proud to be from a province that is really leading the way in the Canadian landscape on the fight against climate change. So I'm interested also to see and hear from the other panelists. And I just wanted to point out what was really unique is I'm from the eastern part of Canada. Bernadette is from the west, so we all kind of sat according to our geographical location. I think we're so in tune with our territories that we've placed ourselves as such.
Thank you. Does Chloe or
Sure.
Bernadette? Sure.
I think for me, traditional knowledge and Western science are definitely important to bring together, but I also see them as a small piece of two very different and complex knowledge systems. So sometimes I notice in projects in the North, we have scientists come up and they want to work with traditional knowledge, but what ends up happening is they get the information and then they slot it into a system that's really predominantly Western. And in that process, we lose a lot of the emotion and the spirit and the love behind that knowledge that comes with it. So I think it's a broader question of worldview for me. I can give you an example. In Bush Kids, while we work to integrate Indigenous teachings, we have different knowledge holders of all ages come in and talk with us, and we share through stories, and we have traditional food. We also try to work hard to balance Western and Indigenous worldview within our policies, within our structures, and honestly, every decision we make day to day has to go through that lens. So recognizing that worldviews contain knowledge, certainly, but they contain more than just knowledge. They contain our actions, our practices, our ways of doing, our ways of thinking, our ways of being, and who we are. Donna.
Sure. So my elders, they're my scientists. And this summer in June, we had Western, I guess, scientists and traditional hunters, providers, elders gather in Fort Yukon, where we discussed, we shared the different views. And one of our elders from Old Crow, he came all the way down on a boat. Like, he is 87, and he came there on a boat to share. And it's probably going to be his last time going because he has cancer. And he said, basically, enough with the talking. You know, quit gathering and quit having meetings. Start doing something. We need to understand that we do need to start working together. We need to start sticking our differences aside, because climate change don't care what color we are, and that we're all going to be impacted. And we need to start respecting and really working together. Our children's future depends on it.
Yeah, I just also want to add, something in my research at the university. It's such a stark contrast between the North and the South. And I just recently heard about these things called protected areas. And I know folks based out of Canada are going through the development of these protected areas, and large tracts of land that are required really as part of our traditional knowledge systems. And I just wonder if, land protection efforts, if you guys could share a little bit about your experience working with communities to protect land, maybe starting with our northern sisters and mothers and aunties, might be interesting to hear.
Sure.
Can you repeat that again?
So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your work with your own community in protecting land. There's a very stark contrast between what's going on in the States and what's going on in Canada regarding protected areas. And I know in the States we're very interested in how you're working with community to enable that protection.
Well, the Gwich'in Nation, which spans throughout Canada and Alaska, there's about 14 communities and about 8,000 of us. And we speak with one voice to protect our sacred land, which is the Arctic Refuge. But there's many other communities and other Indigenous peoples that are at the front lines that are being impacted. And I just started working with a youth of Gwich'in youth, because I feel that this is always going to be an issue, protecting our sacred lands, protecting the resources that are under the ground. So we're educating and training our youth, our connection to the porcupine caribou herd and to the Arctic Refuge. We are also, educating other Alaskans on the importance of protecting right now, especially Alaska, with all the changes that we're experiencing, that we need to start working together. We're learning about each other's issues, and just even being here, it's empowering. Like, we're learning, you're connecting us in other ways. So I'm sure that we're gonna start working together also. We just need to always reach out, connect, and find ways to help each other.
I think for me, the significance of protected areas in our territory is probably twofold. First, we are a small nation. We're only 20,000 members. There's 10 communities. But the work that we've been carrying out to identify protected areas based on traditional knowledge, marrying it with scientific, has proven that traditional knowledge is as effective as scientific knowledge. So being able to participate in sharing that information and kind of showcasing that the knowledge of Indigenous peoples is reflective of what's going on in the natural landscape and can influence, I think, is very significant to the Cree. And I think the other thing that's really unique to the Cree territory is we are heavily impacted by development in our region. When they build the hydroelectric dams, we have massive reservoirs, we've lost a lot of land base, and we have communities that still suffer from the trauma of that. We also, in the southern portion of our territory, are heavily affected by forestry and mining. So my community, the most southern community, we have over 63 trap lines. 90% of our trap lines have been harvested by forestry. So we have the last 10% that remain intact. Old growth forest, the Broadback River Valley, which is one of the last intact old growth forests in our territory, is now, seeing forestry creep into that landscape. Some of our last tallymen that are there, unfortunately, we lost one of them last week, Mr. Louis Neas. He was one of our tallymen from the Broadback River. Our elders are starting to leave us, and with that, we know that we're losing a library of knowledge, so that the fact that we've had the opportunity to build these protected areas in the Cree territory based on input, based on dialogue, based on consultation, right in the field, firsthand, with tallyman, with land users, with their family, that to me is really important. And I think that's a real success story for Canada, that you can have First Nations people come to the table as your equal, sit across the table from you, share their knowledge, share their input into a process, and really achieve something that will contribute significantly towards climate change. That to me is the most important thing. And if anything, being part of this panel, having the opportunity to hear and to learn what these women are doing for their nations, I think it is true what Bernadette said, that we have the opportunity in connecting now to share and showcase the different things that we've done, what we've learned, what was the lessons learned, what was a success for us, to encourage one another, because the fact of the matter is, being Indigenous in this landscape, your voice can often get lost. And I think that as women coming here, feeling empowered, speaking to what we believe our nation's strengths are, I think that's really important. And I hope that message, with those of you that are here, can carry that outside of this room. I think that's, if you want to help First Nations, if you want to help Indigenous people, then point out that there are strong women, there are strong nations showcasing a strong connection to their territory and teaching others. That's what you can do to help First Nations.
I think so. Part of the work I've done is this national scale effort to protect land in Canada. So the government set a target to protect 17% of lands by 2020, and I got involved in that. And when I started, I didn't really know a lot about land conservation and protected areas, and it was a real crash course for me. And I do still feel like I'm learning, but what stands out the most is that the concept of Indigenous-led conservation sometimes looks very, very different from Western conservation. And it's something that I struggled with a lot more than I thought I would in those circles. So I think the concept of land conservation and everything ties back into sovereignty and nationhood, and just as Mandy was saying, understanding that we have really powerful voices and systems and governments that are still thriving in our nations, and we can conserve those lands using our own systems. So it doesn't necessarily have to look like what we imagine a protected area. Protected areas have been really problematic in the past because they were often imposed on areas that had people in those areas. And especially, I don't know a ton about what's happened in the States, but in Canada, people would get kicked off of lands that they'd been living on for millennia to make space for these protected lands. And it was thought that having people outside of this area was the best thing we could do for it, and it would thrive. Not understanding that our landscapes all over North America have been cultivated for abundancy by people forever, and that's why we see such beautiful lands and biodiversity here in Canada. And so there's starting to be an understanding that the old model of a protected area where you're putting a fence around it isn't the way to go, but it runs deep. And even if on the surface that's not what's happening, it's still a real challenge for the Western system to have trust in our ways of conserving our own lands. And I mean, for me, what I do with Bush Kids, that's conservation. When I talk to my elders, they tell me it's getting our young people on the land, it's helping them to know our land. That's where the knowledge comes from. That's where the knowledge that the elders have comes from. And so if we're protecting our land but we're not getting our people on it, we're not doing conservation. And so I think I've learned a lot about it, and I'm still learning. But I think there's ways to integrate, the best of the tools we have from Western systems with our own systems from our nations to really be effective in this area.
Well, I just want to add, I mean, from our viewpoint, obviously we have other challenges to try to protect our land. One, because we're not federally recognized, that makes a difference in the strategies that we take to try to protect our land. We're seeking federal recognition. We have an Aboriginal land title claim in the courts, which is to try to protect our lands for our people. But in the meantime, since that's been going on 25, 30 years, land has been lost. So we have to try to create other strategies. So one of the things that we're doing is trying to get our territory recognized on the National Register as a whole landscape, which isn't really within the National Register. But our state has agreed to work with us on that process. And it's really important because the oil and gas industry are constantly applying for permits, and if you don't have anything on the registry, then they're not looking at a site that may be impacted and evaluating that, and which was a real struggle to talk with our community about, because on the one hand we want to protect and preserve our territory, but on the other hand, you know, there's a struggle with releasing information about sensitive and sacred sites. So instead of doing this as individual sites, we're trying to do it as a whole landscape. And so that's one of our challenges, and it's because the oil and gas industry plays such a significant role in the state of Louisiana and the politics and oil and gas permitting. And in fact, the only people who've commented on our petition have been people from the oil and gas industry, because it's a threat if we are able to become federally recognized to oil and gas development. So that's one of our strategies. And the other strategy is just having a stronger voice and trying to advocate cultural heritage as a human right. Because our way of life is dependent on our land, because we're connected to the land, and our people come from the land and are reflected in the land and in the resources that are there. We think that it's important to value that, and that the value should not just be on what you can take from the land, you know, as oil and gas, or you know, or who is living on the land. And so I think that we need to be more visible in that, and that's one of the things that we're working on to try to protect our land, our territory, and in fact our whole way of life and being, which is threatened by sea level rise.
Yeah, Mandy. So I have a lot more questions, but I feel very awkward about this because back home, the women do the asking and the men do the answering. I come from a matrilineal society, and that's how our identity flows, is through our mothers and our aunties. But I want to also provide some time for people in the audience to ask some questions if anybody would like to, at this time, have a question for some of our panelists.
So, Kamali Ometeo. My name is Tomas Lopez Jr. I am Mexica Otomi, Diné, Apache, and Lakota. I come from Denver, Colorado, and I'm also a part of a group called the International Indigenous Youth Council. I work closely with NDN, and Nick Tilson is like one of the main people that made the Youth Council possible, so shout out to NDN. We're partners for the U.S. climate strike, and the reason why we got involved with the climate strike is because we saw a major absence of the Black and Indigenous and Brown communities in them. And every time we would go to these spaces, they almost felt unsafe for us to be there. And so we joined the climate strike for that reason. And even still, in like our first kind of big strike happened on Friday, we're still getting feedback from other states that Indigenous and Black youth and women are not being properly and appropriately acknowledged and brought to the table. So I'm still on the calls. And we're having another climate strike on Black Friday, and I really want to indigenize it. And I was wondering in what ways y'all thought would be good ideas to bring to the table so that we can make, because in Denver, I organized the one in Denver personally. I stayed back at home because I felt that's where I needed to be. And I really pushed missing and murdered migrant, Indigenous, and Black women that were killed while in police custody, and it completely changed the tone of our entire march. And so I'm just wondering in what ways ideas you might have, you all might have to help us in bigger cities like this, or LA, or New York, or DC.
First, I would probably reach out to a lot more Indigenous. There's a lot more people out there. We just, like, you're right, we don't see them. But I would definitely, because I'm working on something similar to this, reaching out, trying to get support across and maybe we could do something together also with our youth council. And we're putting like guidelines, right? And I'm always pushing, do it in a good way, work in a good way. That's the way you work with others, the way you talk to others, and even the way you think about others. Just always be kind. Sometimes there's people have their own agendas, just kind of set the pace that this is, we're not getting confrontational, we're here just making a statement, and make sure that you have like liaisons for, in case anything gets out of hand. Have you ever tried the training? Have you did youth trainings? And so having those people there would also help. Yeah, good luck, and just reach out. I'd be happy to help in any way that I can. I really appreciate you guys stepping up, and I'm really sorry that you guys are even having to. I feel ashamed that this is on you guys, and I would love to do more, and so I'm here if you need me.
What comes to mind for me is when I do my Bush Kids work, I'm always thinking about that intersection. Like, how do we learn? What do we do? And some of the things that come out for me are how Indigenous peoples tend to learn really intergenerationally. It'd be interesting to try to get different age groups involved, and maybe when you talk about starting in a good way and that you're all here for this reason, thinking about having a knowledge holder, an elder, open what you're doing in ceremony to ground everybody together. And then something I always love that I feel, it's ubiquitous to cultures everywhere, but it's also so important to us as Indigenous peoples, is food. Sharing around food. It brings people together, and especially if you have, local food that you can share and offer, to be inviting people to join you. I think that would be lovely, and best of luck as well. Tahuna.
I'll also speak to it. I actually invited our youth Grand Chief to attend this event. She could not be here today because she was doing a consultation with the youth communities. So our youth council is set up exactly like our government, where we have one youth Grand Chief, deputy youth Grand Chief, and each community elects a youth chief from their community, and then they sit together in council. I had the opportunity about last year, a year and a half ago, to travel with the youth Grand Chief. She was newly elected, extremely young, very vibrant, willing to learn, and curious. I invited her with me to visit the Sami Nation in Finland, and we were supporting them. They were affected by an Arctic Railway corridor that was going to cut right down the middle of their traditional territories that would completely affect their rain herding activities. And having her participate and visit these communities opened her eyes. A way, like, seeing her just become so impassioned with Indigenous people on an international scale was a major learning experience for her as a leader. But I think the thing that really transformed her leadership is that travel opportunity made her realize that other Indigenous peoples around the world were being impacted by development. So to me, the biggest thing that I think is a major influence to youth is giving them the opportunity to exchange, to meet with one another, like she said, to share each other's food, to tell each other stories of how your environment is shaping you. What does it mean growing up to be Indigenous in the Canadian or American context? And I think that for me is probably my wish, if you wish to connect with our youth council, is offering that opportunity to exchange, because youth now, I see their skill is influenced through social media. You know, these campaigns that they run, that they connect, that they can just speak to a message so passionately, and their strength is through the use of the internet and social media platforms. So I think for me, that's one of the things that, you know, as an up and coming Indigenous leader, it is important to always learn from other people, to share and to connect, to just take that time to sit with somebody in a space and share what your culture is and what it means to you. So if you wish, I would love to connect you to our youth council also.
Now, I hear the call for maybe the next decade for Indigenous youth at the United Nations level. A question here.
Hi, thank you. I have a question following up on, I forget what's your name, the woman's name? Chloe. Okay. Following up on something that Chloe said, where you were talking about the difference between, you know, Western approaches to conservation and Indigenous approaches to conservation. And I thought it would be interesting if you talk a little bit more about where you see there's clash and where you see there's synergy, because, I mean, let's just be honest about it, right? You got, like, Native communities don't have the numbers on their side, and they also don't have the broad support on their side. So to be successful in protecting Native lands, you have to appeal and get the buy-in from Western culture. So I'm curious to hear, like, what are some of the differences? And then based on those differences, your thoughts on what are some of the strategies to use to leverage those differences or those synergies so that you can protect your land and the land of other Native peoples?
That's a great question. Thank you.
I'm a realist.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess maybe let's start with the similarities. So, Western conservation and Indigenous nations, when looking at a protected area, both want to conserve the land. So when I started, I was like, you know, great, like this is perfect. We're in these great spaces, and then I quickly learned that the differences are what we see as effective protection. So I guess from a Western perspective, to me, it seems like humans are a detriment to our lands. We can help, but mostly we need to get out of the way. You know, there's too many people on the planet. We're crowding. We need to isolate ourselves in cities. Like, that kind of perspective is what comes through. Whereas from an Indigenous perspective, people are part of the landscapes and are not only destructive, but also have the capacity to create and to help and to be part of ecosystems thriving. So that's the main difference I see. And, you know, an example from my territory about the caribou, actually, our caribou numbers are dwindling too, and they're in trouble everywhere. And from a Western conservation perspective, it's quite clear: leave the caribou alone. Stop hunting caribou. But from our perspective, if we were to stop hunting the caribou, that's an important and sacred part of our relationship with the caribou. And to stop that would mean the end of our relationship with the caribou, which would mean the end of both us and the caribou. Caribou are people, and people are caribou. There's no separation. And so while both groups are saying we need to conserve the caribou, that's a very different strategy. And so I think the solution from where I see it is we need to recognize that there are these two different worldviews. I don't think we're going to come together. I've spent a lot of time talking with I'm 29. I've been doing this work for like 4 years. It feels like a long time talking with people about it. And I don't think that it's going to be easy to come together and change worldviews. I don't think it's possible. I think what we have to do is recognize that there's two knowledge systems and both bring important tools and values. And at this point, that means recognizing Indigenous knowledge systems, because our Western systems are mainstream across North America. And so lots of people don't even recognize that there's these other worldviews operating. So we're like this, we're just not balanced. So what I say to people, we're not trying to impose our way and say it's better, but what we are trying to do is balance the two. And that requires holding up Indigenous systems and creating awareness. And then once we're there, then we can have a real conversation. What are our tools? What are our beliefs? What can we contribute? And what can we contribute? And then we can work together, I think, to get to solutions. Does that answer your question?
It does, but I kind of want it. I also want to see it go. I also want to see it go a little further, because I'm thinking about, okay, maybe there won't ever be full mutual understanding, but then in the meantime, you'll have a pipeline running through your land. You'll be flooded out by rising sea levels. So and this is an immediate need, right? Like, we know this is going on right now. So I'm just trying to think about like how to acknowledge and recognize the realities at hand and then exploit them to the best of your ability to protect your land.
I'd like to share an example of what happened in the Cree territory. So when we developed these protected areas, like I said, our coordinator did consultations and we had feedback from land users, but we also incorporated our scientific component, which was looking at waterways and really examining where headwaters came from in the Cree territory and protecting those areas. When we sat at the table with Quebec, they had a very similar approach, which was protecting water types and different biotopes of water. I know it was like hard water, soft water, different types of water, but we really focused on waterways and headwaters. So it was similar. The difference was we protected everything that fed from a headwater. So all the wildlife, all the fish habitat, all of the plantation. And on their end, they were protecting biodiversity. So they wanted to get every little piece of everything from the spectrum within our territory. Mm-hmm. And the only way we could get Quebec to understand that wasn't working for us was when we shared this analogy. And I love this analogy because it makes so much sense. When the Cree look at the Cree territory, USG, we look at it like a fridge, like a grocery store. Okay, so this is where we source our food from. So I'm telling the person from Quebec, I said, look, you're asking us to shop in the fridge and go every single aisle and take one thing from each shelf and put it in the basket. But my culture, my diet is the meat and the berries and the vegetable section. I don't eat from the middle. So when you ask me to protect that, you're endangering my need to practice my culture, practice Cree way of life, and practice the wildlife, the moose, the caribou, the things that are important to our way of life. How can you do that? And from there, I think you could kind of see across the table, this flash of, I don't want to say a light bulb went on, but this flash of understanding that, we need to adjust. We need to adjust our framing of this. And when we sat down and looked at the areas they had identified, because we had proposed areas and they were proposing areas, a lot of the areas that they proposed were within the boundaries of our territorial area. And my biggest fear was that they would come back with, this little piece carved out in the corner where nobody really went. And I really think having that kind of dialogue and exchange and trying to have like a very common sense approach to using analogies that were, understandable by everybody helped reframe that discussion. And I think that's the challenge in really getting other people to understand how their impacts or their decisions are affecting you as a First Nation, I think that's key. If you can unlock that door, you'll have a lot of success in having a strong voice at that table. So that was our little takeaway. And I think that for me was the moment in our negotiations where it kind of changed a bit. You know, they were different with us. And I really appreciated that.
Now, Mandy. Patty, a quick response.
Yeah, just want to add, one of the frustrations that tribal people have is that there's a problem and they meet with scientists, and based on the knowledge, they say, well, we think X should be done. And then the scientist said, well, we should study that. And then they take 5 years to study it, or maybe they suggest something else. And then 5 years later, they go, yes, that was a good idea. So they have to somehow validate that, and that's very stressful and problematic because a lot of things happen within that 5 years that, oh, maybe we can't do it now because now this is vulnerable and it's not sustainable, and so you have a loss. So I just want to go back and mention, we're a partner with Sea Grant, and we worked a lot on traditional ecological knowledge, and actually we had a national meeting in Alaska where different Sea Grants brought in their tribal partners to talk about traditional and local knowledge and to try to it was a visioning effort to develop best practices for working with traditional and local knowledge for education, research, and outreach. And I think that's important because, they have scientists associated with them, and we need to have scientists recognize the importance of traditional ecological knowledge and these local knowledge holders so they can think about that and in the science and recognize that, tribal people are scientists. You fish by the moon. You don't say, oh, I wonder what I should do. You're like, no, I'm looking at the moon. I'm looking at the tides. And there's a recognition in that. So, I think that's important to move things like that forward.
Now, well, we're running a little short on time. I think maybe one more question. Sure.
Yeah, I'll just speak to that mic. Thank you for coming all this way and sharing your stories. It's very inspiring. My name is Thomas. I come from Norway, where a large part of the Sami nations live, also some of them with the caribou, the reindeer. I've been working with climate change on different angles, and I've been very frustrated with the public and the governmental sides, although they're very important, and focused my efforts on the private efforts with companies, corporations. And today you've spoken mainly, from what I heard, about your work with public entities. Can you just tell, I know we have limited time, so just something maybe short to keep in mind about where can companies fit into this? Because as much as they can be part of the problem, they can also be part of the solution. I always try to look for what are their overall objectives and how can we make that play in tune with our climate efforts. So do you have any examples of either things you're already doing or things that you see would be so important to bring the companies on board to work together? Thank you.
Great question.
I'd like to share quickly. So for us in Alaska, we're having people come into our homelands and making decisions about our future, and they're not involving us. The Bureau of Land Management, which, they turned our sacred lands into an oil field if they can have their way. I've been visiting banks and going to actual oil and gas company shareholder meetings. And I was surprised at one of the British Petroleum that I went to, and I spoke to one of their senior staff. And they, in Alaska, it's much different. Like, I was born into a corporation. They don't represent me. They don't represent. I'd rather have healthy land and healthy animals. But when I went there, I was surprised that they were saying that they're doing a good job in Alaska. I see different. I see my sick animals. I see our land deteriorating. And so you have to, I think, connect with the indigenous people there, not the corporations, not like take the time to actually connect and listen to the voices of the people who's going to be impacted, because we're being ignored, we're being dismissed, and we have every right to be here. It's our homelands, and we matter. We're grandmothers, we're mothers, we're fathers, we have jobs, and we're simply trying to exist. And so I really encourage, like, get to know the people. Don't take people's word for it. That's benefiting. Okay, that's benefiting from the development or any kind of extraction. Go and see the actual people that are living there.
I want to give a really good example of something that I think, to me, speaks to your question. About 3 years ago, I was invited to speak at a fashion summit here, and I couldn't for the life of me understand why they wanted First Nations to speak at a fashion summit. And then I learned about viscose and forestry. And I think that the fashion industry has done a really good job in trying to understand their sourcing. And having the opportunity to go there and share how forestry has impacted my nation was not only a learning experience for me, but I think really hit home with these large name brands that were there, like Ralph Lauren, Zara, Eileen Fisher. You know, we had all of these brands that were coming into this space and had sustainability protocols, had officers promoting sustainability within their company. I think that, like, that aspect of the corporate world trying to be aware of their impact on the environment and their footprint really showed to me that there are some industries that are aware of it. There are some, like Bernadette said, you know, our mining companies that promote the good story of we have a relationship with this community and things are going well. In some instances it's true, in some instances it's not. But I think the work of Indigenous people is to make that information available. So for me, one of my goals within the Cree Nation is to have a sustainability protocol, to have it on our website, to have corporate, understand if you're sourcing from the Cree territory, here are the things that you're impacting, here are the places where you can get more information. And one of the things I would like to also promote is earlier this summer we had the mayor from New York, Mayor de Blasio. He sent a team to the Cree territory to ask what is the impact of purchasing hydroelectric energy on the Cree First Nation. So we had a group of people come up, we gave them a tour, we showcased Cree culture, the Cree territory, and I was very appreciative of that leadership took that initiative to really engage directly. I think that's the key. Call them on the phone and ask them. I guarantee 110% of the time they will invite you and they will tell you their own story with their own words.
Yeah, well, thank you. Well, we're coming to the end of our session here, and I wanted to build a little bit on Mandy's story. Back in the early 90s, mid-90s, the Haudenosaunee people were actually trying to support the Cree people by stopping New York City from purchasing this cheap hydropower. So we had some Mohawk brothers and sisters watching what was going on, and there was this really famous meeting up in Ottawa, and Matthew Kunkum was there kind of being invited into this meeting, considering what the Cree people were going to get in exchange for this development of hydroelectricity. And there were a lot of aunties and grandmas there watching Matthew enter Parliament and very upset with him, feeling like maybe there was a little co-optation going on. And, Matthew sort of said, well, this is part of the process. I've got to go in there and deal with Hydro-Quebec. And the first thing those ladies said is, Matthew, what are you doing? I'm telling your mom. And that was the reaction these women had, and that's exactly right. We have this open invite, but we have this intergenerational effort in all of these processes to protect traditional knowledge, to protect lands, and it needs to have this open invite is a very important suggestion, I think, for companies and governance. We welcome you into our longhouses, into our wigwams, into our places in our communities. So I just wanted to share that. And thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you for listening and being part of this discussion. And most of all, thank you, ladies, for being here and taking the time to present. So in our traditional way, in our way we close things, because I opened it in my language, is we would say, Una enwa digaranetia disne yekwa wetath nesu, which means that now we are going to build up the embers, and we're going to bank them up so that they still glow when we meet again, and that fire can be started again. So, Nyawaha.
Thank you, Una.